Hello, I'm Sean Johnson, candidate for the Microsoft Azure Training Architect position at Linux Academy. I'm here today to talk a bit about Azure Functions, specifically what they are, why you as a developer would use them, and then I'll show you an example of an Azure function in the Azure portal. So what are Azure Functions? Well, Azure Functions are part of Microsoft's modern serverless architecture, offering event-driven cloud computing that is easy for developers to use. It provides a way to run small pieces of code or functions in the cloud without developers having to worry themselves about the infrastructure or platform that the function is running on. So what makes up an Azure function? An Azure function typically consists of three components. First, there's the code that performs an individual action. For example, you may have a function that performs a resize on an uploaded image. Another example might be processing an incoming queue message. In these examples, checking the blob storage for the uploaded image or the queue for the incoming message are known as events or triggers. Events are the second component of an Azure function. They are what makes the function execute. An HTTP request is another example of an event, as is a simple timer or a cron job. The third component is the data to be processed, the image or the queue message itself. The data is connected to the code with what's known as input and output bindings. So how do I write this code? Well, Azure Functions support a variety of programming languages, such as C#, F#, Node.js, Python, PHP, and Java. Functions also accommodate scripting options like Bash, Batch, and PowerShell. Packages from NPM or NuGet can also be added to Azure Functions, providing even more flexibility with the use of these well-tested libraries. You have the ability to write and test your code in the Azure portal itself, or use other development tools such as Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. Another benefit to Azure Functions is the ability to scale up and down on demand. The cloud provider, Azure, performs the scaling and the provisioning of resources automatically. Once again, no more constantly monitoring the infrastructure and adding servers and other resources during peak performance, only to have those systems sit idle most of the time. Perhaps the most attractive benefit to Azure Functions is the costing model. In a typical development architecture, you would always require a web server, Azure Web App, or some other environment always available to publish your applications. These would typically incur charges whether your apps were in use or not. With Azure Functions, you only pay for what you use. Being a serverless offering, you're only charged when your function is actually running, not while it is sitting idle waiting for something to happen. This means no more hosting virtual machines or running apps in the cloud. Azure will figure out as much or as little infrastructure that is needed to run your function on demand. The cost savings can be substantial. Now we've come to the part you've all been waiting for. Let's see an actual Azure function in action. I'll be writing a function that executes based off a webhook or a simple HTTP request. We will be able to provide input to the function and see the output in the Azure portal, as well as Postman, a free tool you can use to test post-based HTTP requests. We'll also be able to monitor the application in Azure to see if it succeeded. Ready? Let's go. I've opened my Azure portal, and as you can see, there's not much going on. So I'm going to begin by creating a new function app. I'll do so by clicking Create a Resource at the top left of the portal. I'll search the marketplace for a function app, and then I'll click Create. We have to provide a few things before we can create the app. First, we have to give it a name. This name can be anything you want as long as it's unique in the Azure Websites.NET subspace. If it isn't, Azure's going to let you know. I'm going to call this Sean Tech. I'm going to keep everything else the same, especially the hosting plan. As you can see, it defaults to consumption plan. Remember when we talked about the costs associated with Azure Functions and how you will only pay for what you use? That's what consumption plan does for us. If we were to choose an app service plan, costing would function much like a traditional Azure web app, with predetermined capacity allocation and, of course, associated costs. Once we're happy with our settings, we'll click Create. It will take about a minute or so to create the app, so I'll be right back when it's finished. Our function app resource is created, so let's go have a look under the hood. The first thing we want to do is actually generate code that will execute as part of the function. The Quick Start Guide makes it really easy for you to get started developing your own Azure Functions. We'll be using the portal today, but as was previously stated in the video, you can use a variety of other tools to create your own functions, such as Visual Studio and VS Code. Since we'll be using the portal, I'll select the last option, In Portal. Then I'll click Continue. Since we're going to be writing a webhook function, I'm going to select the first option, Webhook plus API, and then I'll click Create. Azure will then begin creating our function for us. As you can see, Azure's already provided us with a sample C# code to return a name that's provided in an HTTP query string. If we click on Test on the right-hand side, we'll see that we can provide a name field, which has already been pre-populated with Azure. I'll call it Sean, and then we'll run the function and see the output. As you can see, we've got some logging here that the function did execute successfully, and we have an output with 200 OK status and Hello Sean. If I change the name to Simone and run it again, it will log again that it succeeded, and our output will say Hello Simone. I'm going to modify this code, adding 3 more lines of code that go get the host name of the web instance that's actually running the function, as well as its IP address. I'll be presenting this to the user when the function's executed. And then we'll save and run again. As you can see, in addition to my Hello Simone message, I get welcome to the host name and the IP address of the web instance that's actually executed the function. So now we've got our code, we've run it, and we've gotten an output. Fantastic. Except, are we ever really going to execute Azure Functions solely in the Azure portal? Of course not. We want these to run in a browser window or any other HTTP client. Since this function will work with either GET or POST HTTP methods, one of the tools we can use is simply by opening our web browser, pasting in the URL, and executing the function that way. But what is the URL? Well, we can find that by clicking on Get Function URL right next to the Run box. As you can see, our URL is listed in the box below. It starts with the name of our Azure Function app resource, seantech.azurewebsites.net, followed by /API, followed by the name of our function, HTTP trigger 1. Let's copy that now. We'll open up a new browser window, paste it into our address bar, and let's hit enter. As you can see, we're getting a bad request and being asked to place a name into the query string or the request body. Let's do that now. I'll hit enter, and now we see the same output that we saw in the Azure portal, but now we see it in a web browser. For post methods, we use tools like Postman to simulate the post method that would be passed in an HTTP form. I'll paste my URL with the name variable in the URL box, and I'll hit send. Once again, we see our output, Hello Sean, followed by our host name and IP address information. So this was an introduction into Azure Functions. I hope you learned some valuable information about them and are able to use them to begin your serverless development journey. I'm Sean Johnson, and don't forget to visit Linux Academy for the most in-depth training and certification courses for Linux, AWS, DevOps, and of course, Azure.